So hello everybody, welcome to this broadcast, and I'm going to be talking with Raj Patel, and he'll be discussing coaching and mentoring for business managers and leaders, among many other topics. And Raj has some associations with the college. You may recognise him from having taught Foundation last term. So if I can ask you to start with, please, Raj. Looking at your profile, it said that you originally from Kenya, but with Indian heritage and UK nationality. So could I ask you perhaps for our listeners, viewers, to tie that all together? How did you come from Kenya to the UK originally?
Yes, welcome everyone. And in the 1950s, 60s, there was quite a lot of workers that were invited over from India to East Africa, in and amongst the British colonies to deliver jobs that needed to be done. And then after the Second World War, the same crowd were invited to the UK. And so my parents basically tripped around the world like so many others. So within the first 7 years of my life, I've lived on 3 continents.
Okay. And whereabouts in the UK did you end up?
In Leicester,
Right.
so in the East Midlands. So if you notice any tinge of accent, that's probably what it is.
Okay, I'm not an expert, but maybe detecting something. You went to the University of Birmingham, is that correct?
That's right.
And I think you said you studied, was it biochemical engineering?
Medical biochemistry. So
Medical biochemistry.
that's the first degree I did there. Yeah.
And then went on to study for a Master's in Development Administration.
That's right.
Which sounds intriguing. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I think if you think about a Master's in Business Administration, but then related that to the international development sector. So Birmingham University and its International Development Department did a Master's in Business Administration for international development.
I see, okay. And did that involve any placements overseas?
Yes, and while I was studying my Master's there, and it was a part-time course, I was working as well, Birmingham University, Edinburgh University, quite a lot of universities would do consultancies for the international development sector, for the bilaterals, for the multilaterals, for the NGO sector. And Birmingham managed to win quite a lot of bids. So within my first year there, I remember doing a major project in Nepal. So you would end up being a consultant, a student, as well as doing your job at the same time.
Did that seem a lot of responsibility at such a, I guess, relatively tender age?
Yes, not so tender, but yeah,
Okay.
but yeah, it was enjoyable.
Sure.
You plenty of energy. You could get flights at a drop of a button in those days.
Okay, so what exactly were you doing in Nepal?
Yes, so in Nepal, it was quite an interesting assignment. So the regions in Nepal, 5 major regions at the time, they wanted, it's called DFID now, it was called the ODA in those days.
Overseas Development Agency?
Yes, Overseas Development Agency, and it's now the UK Aid Agency as well, it's called now. So the consultancy was about how do we get strengthen the local non-governmental organisations, because in developing countries you had non-governmental organisations delivering a lot of the services that possibly the state should have been, but state not having the funds or the trained people. So the consultancy is about how do we get in these 5 regions of Nepal that strengthened and also sustainable. So how does it earn money as well as deliver the goods? So we came up with a project proposal which was to use the cultural norms in Nepal, which is a Mahaguti model, which is why don't we have buildings which has 3 floors and a ground floor.
Okay.
And the ground floor would be all the workshops where you'd have micro enterprises. So the middle floor would be the learning and the studying centre, and the top floor would be let out to businesses or anyone who could pay rent. And so you've got this sustainable model, but you're training, you're strengthening, and actually influencing policy as well. So it was really quite a neat little project to start with. And of course, I got hooked into this sort of work.
Maybe we could return to that later to look a little bit more about how that ties in to Nepalese culture, this model. But moving on, you one of the many roles that you undertake is as a coach and a mentor. Now, I'm hoping you'll be able to sort of define the difference between these two roles for us. I don't know if you have any material you'll be able to show us.
Well, I did prepare a slide for this, so let me jump to that slide. And so the difference between coaching and mentoring. I think first of all I would say that anyone has probably done a little bit of coaching, a little bit of mentoring without knowing it. So you've got that informal, and especially from certain cultures, you're obliged to be a mentor for the younger generation, and the younger generation will always ascribe a respect and a status to the next generation, and certainly 2 generations on. And so in terms of coaching and mentoring, I think a lot of people will know about mentoring. Coaching is done in a slightly different way, and even though we use the terms together, they are quite different. So coaching is much more performance-based.
Right.
And so you would possibly work with leaders of organisations and say, look, what do you want to achieve? What performance do you want to develop? And objectives would be set around that by the coach and the coachee. And whereas mentoring is much more relationship-based.
I see.
And so one is shorter term, and the other is longer term. One is more about developing specific skills, coaching, specific styles, even specific postures within specific contexts, whereas mentoring is about overall development. You've got, in coaching, you're trying to provoke the person who you're coaching to develop themselves.
Okay.
And in mentoring, you're, in a sense, giving them the tools, giving them the ideas, the experiences, and maybe even contacts.
Right.
And so you've got a very different approach. And often coaching is done by maybe someone in your own organisation. It's seen as part of some line manager duties, whereas mentoring, I found, works much, much better when it's done by someone who's independent and external.
Okay, that's interesting. And to bring in a related term, which I'm sure many of our students are familiar with, training, is that something which is not, a word which is not used when we get to senior management level? Is it always coaching, even if it is training?
Very, very good question, because I often don't use the word training. I prefer to use the word learning. Okay. Because it's about not just upskilling someone. Training almost feels a bit like, I'll show you what to do, you copy me.
Yeah.
And whereas it's, and so if you're using a coaching approach to learning in your training, that's good. I try and do that in my lectures. And I'm sure my students get fed up with me, because I'm always provoking them to ask questions as well as answer questions. Say, well, I need to know what you're thinking, not what I'm trying to tell you to think. And so, of course, they're all in the same realm, but there are emphases, nuances that are quite specific.
Do you have any suggestions for anybody who happens to find themselves in a class similar to yours, where they're having questions fired at them, challenges, if you like, put to them, and that may be second, third, even fourth language environment for them, and they lack confidence in expressing themselves in another language?
Yes, and of course, at the Oxford Business College, we're all used to that, aren't we? Experiment. That's one suggestion, and I love to experiment. Maybe it's my scientist background, I love to have a go at different things. So one thing that I found works really well, especially when you've got remote classes with lots of students with different languages and different confidences. I often just say, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put you into breakout groups of 2 and just do a buzz group. And all I want you to do in your breakout group is get to know each other and come up with a question about what we were talking about. And you can ask it in any language, I say. And then I open it up, saying if I don't understand it, someone else will, and allow others to interpret that for me. So really,
kind of quite a collaborative and participative approach.
And at the end of every lecture, I measure 4 things, and one of the measures is how participatory was a session. I get the students to answer that.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so that they're involved in owning the session.
Yes.
And the experiment that we're carrying out in the learning.
That's interesting. So have you done any consultancy work for teaching institutions?
I have, in lots of places actually, universities, colleges. I've also coached principals of colleges in India, in USA, in Africa, and it's really, the world and its valuing of education is very different. I love working with educational institutes in South, in the global South.
Southern Hemisphere, then?
Southern Hemisphere, so the developing countries, as people like to call them, but because educators are so much more respected, and so any time we would call an event, we would always be oversubscribed. In the West, in the Northern Hemisphere, you're often having to market much harder for workshops and training on any topic, whereas there you're having to limit numbers, and so yes, the thirst, of course, you will learn if you want to learn, and so the thirst for learning is quite high.
Is it purely cultural? This respect that perhaps is more apparent in the South than in the North, and could you ascribe it to anything in particular? Could you ascribe this difference?
It's definitely to do with culture, but of course cultures are based on our values.
Yeah.
And so if we have a value, first of all, that values older folk, if it values education, and it values the interaction in a relationship, then you will find that more in certain cultures, in certain, and so it's definitely. But I think also the need. I'm sure that in where people are desperate to learn because they know why they want to learn, their motivation for learning is so much higher, and the need might be that they want their parents to be proud of them, or it may be that actually I am desperate to get out of whatever context I'm into a better context. Or it could be that they have hopes and aspirations that are, it's quite amazing. I remember being in a small school, but all the schools were children who didn't have parents, or their parents had left them to be cared for. And just talking to the youngsters there, very moving. You ask them, well, what is it you want to do? Every single one of them had the highest of expectations of their own lives, and that was quite impressive.
It is, yes. and certainly understandable if you're looking to aspire to change a situation. Your level of motivation in most cases naturally will be higher. Is there anything that can be done in situations where people are in relatively affluent societies and perhaps don't value education so much to change that situation?
Yes, it's. I've been on boards of schools in the UK and in India, and one of the things that I'm always banging on about is how do we as schools encourage learners to learn. So how do we give them an appetite for learning? And oddly enough, so I'm on the board of a school in Oxford at the moment, and oddly enough, the pandemic and a year of disrupted school attendance, the teacher said, oh, our attendance is so much better than we ever expected. The behaviour in class is better. It's almost as if having had a period of not taking it for granted, and
That
all that comes with it.
Yes.
So I think whatever we can do to say this is why it's worth it, I'm sure is going to help with the students to pick themselves up.
Okay.
Own their learning, and yeah.
All right. You mentioned you're on the board of a school in Oxford, and if I can phrase it this way, looking at your CV, looking back through your long and very impressive CV, you've been involved with many organisations around the world. I'm just going to ask you about a few of them.
Go ahead. Yeah.
The Leprosy Mission. I also want to ask you, I'll come back to this in a moment, the Housing Diversity Network and Opportunity International, which I think for some people could be easily mistaken for Amnesty International, but I assume that the two are unrelated.
I worked at Amnesty.
You worked at Amnesty as well? Okay, fine. Well, can we begin with the Leprosy Mission? Whereabouts, what was the nature of your involvement with the organisation, and where were you working?
Yes, so the Leprosy Mission. Now we might think that leprosy has been eradicated, but actually there's quite a lot of leprosy that still lingers in the world, and there are certain countries, India, Indonesia. In fact, there have been cases of leprosy a few years back that were found in the US and Europe as well.
Right.
So Leprosy Mission and the work that I did at it's 100 and I don't know, 1884 I think it was started. So it's a very old organisation. They were going through a transition, and so I came on board, and can't quite remember what my title was, but it was organisational transformation. So how do we transform our own organisation, as well as the branches that we have in lots of different parts of the world?
Okay, so it is a global organisation.
Yes, international.
Yeah.
Yes, and so my role was to do the organisational development and organisational change aspects of the Leprosy Mission. Now, of course, leprosy, even though it hasn't been eradicated, doesn't quite return as much income. People are interested in other things. And so it was also about saying, well, what can the Leprosy Mission do with its years of expertise, its structures around the world? And actually what we developed was that in order to eradicate leprosy, you have to eradicate stigma. It wasn't, because you can cure leprosy, you can treat leprosy with chemicals, with pills. And in fact, many drug companies will let you have them free as their corporate social responsibility.
Okay.
That's not the problem. It's the stigma around it. So the Leprosy Mission interested, well, what are other areas where there is a stigma? And how can we help to unpack, dismantle the stigma in order to dismantle the disease?
All right. Okay. So did you... were you brought in initially to have this discussion with management?
I had a full-time role with them for a couple of years.
Okay.
So it was really, it was too big a job to do as a consultancy, but it was like a short-term assignment.
And did you feel at the end of your term that you'd been able to make the changes that you wanted to within the organisation?
Very many of them. It's quite interesting with organisations that they want change, but actually there's often quite a resistance to change as well. And it's not just the Leprosy Mission, it's any organisation. So it was a case of we managed to get certain change, but the resistance to change often is around where is the decision, where are the decisions, where is the power held? Can that, because really the power needed to have been devolved to the places where leprosy and stigma is most prevalent, where you're trying to create change on the ground.
Yes, yes.
But that was a struggle, and so I felt that we've made enough changes to say that we had thought about how stigma can be addressed in different ways, but the power still, and it was more difficult probably for the older the organisation is, to be shifted.
So structurally, there was still work to be done.
Structurally, yes, but sometimes transition has to occur in bite-sized pieces.
Yes.
And so I think we achieved quite a number of bite-sized pieces. I think, and of course, with personnel changes, other bite-sized pieces can occur. That's why people like me stay in business. I think there's always more organised change work to be done.
Okay. And the Housing Diversity Network, I understand that was more in the UK.
Yes, it's a national network of housing associations, and it was trying to promote all areas of diversity. So the big 6 areas of ethnicity, gender, disability, sexual orientation, age and religion, as well as then the other protected characteristics as well. So it's had a big brief.
And how long were you with them?
Well, I was only there for a short term, and just less than 2 years. And then the pandemic came along.
Okay, so relatively recent.
And actually, yes, the organisation is based up in the north, so I would be driving from Oxford to the north, 3.5 hours there, 3.5 hours back, would stay over a couple of nights. And then I decided that, you know what, it's time to use the pandemic to stop that. So,
right.
And it gives me a chance to do those things that I want to do. You might have guessed I'm a little bit older than most. And so,
Raj, just before the break, we were talking about work you've done with different organisations. And I mentioned Opportunity International. Perhaps you could tell people a little bit about what it does. Yes,
it's a fantastic organisation, Opportunity International. They do microfinance, or then it got called development finance. Nowadays it's called inclusive finance. So basically, if you're poor, how are you going to earn enough money to look after your family? And so microfinance, what it does do is it gives small loans that have to be repaid with a small interest, and it equips the entrepreneurs to set up a small business and obviously to earn money for their family. But the key thing about microfinance is that it gets these entrepreneurs involved in small groups. So there's a peer encouragement, a peer accountability that's there. So Opportunity International have programs in 63 countries across the world, and my role with Opportunity was the Asia bit, and I was based in Delhi at the time. Okay. And so these programs there would be hundreds, thousands of entrepreneurs in these countries, and really very successful. They would pay back the loan, and of course you could use a paid back loan to lend to others. You would organise them into groups of groups, and they would, in Bangalore, we set up a bank just for the micro entrepreneurs, and also to provide some pressure and influence to the government to change legislation so it would be easier for the entrepreneurs to carry out their businesses in their at village level, in rural areas. So, and most of the entrepreneurs were women.
Interesting. Was this state funded?
No. It was. It's a charity, and they would raise money from individuals, from faith groups, from they would get grants from government aid agencies. Quite a lot of the funding came from charitable giving, but as I say, then it would be reinvested, because once you loaned it out and you got it back, you would still have some other capital to be used over and again.
Yes, yes. Do you think there's a strong case to be made for funding for these types of organisations coming from the charitable sector as opposed to state funding?
Yes, it's not quite as easy as one or the other. I would say there's a case to be made for both and. I pay my taxes, and I do want my 0.7% to be doing good, not just for us but to others. And so
yes.
So that's state funding. But of course, I will also do charitable giving, and Britain is brilliant for that. So many people give sacrificially because they want to be part of making a difference as well. So I would say it's a both and.
Right, yes, absolutely. As well as all we've been discussing so far, I understand you're also currently director of two companies, which are Diverse Thinking and ASDAL.
Yeah.
What can you tell me about them, and is there any significance of the names of these organisations?
Yes, ASDAL in Sanskrit, which is the basic language behind many of the languages in the Indian subcontinent, means strength in vulnerability. And so you can imagine that, the role of ASDAL is about trying to bring strength, but not trying to lose the identity, the vulnerability, the character of the business, the organisation, the NGO that ASDAL would work with. So the work of ASDAL was very much this organisational development, and that's been carried out through lots of freelancers across the world, and most I would have trained along the way to one form of organisational development, where it is about making sure that you strengthen the soft side of the organisation as well as the hard. So the hard side being policies, practices, systems, structures, and the soft side being the culture, the mindset, the relationships.
And how do you strengthen that?
You have to instill a culture within an organisation. So first thing to do is to say, well, let's do a mapping of what our culture is like at the moment. And then you have interactive sessions that said, well, what do we want the culture to be? And then how do we move from one to the other? So if the culture is not very participatory, but that's the culture that people want, then you have to find ways in which that culture can be changed within that. And so you would have not only a map, but a plan as to how that culture can be developed through the system. An example was with the BBC, and they wanted to have a culture which was up to date and future-proofed. So that they said, this is what our audience is going to be like in the future. Okay. But we don't seem to represent it. Our programs, our way of thinking is quite different. And so I think there were about 40,000 employees at the BBC at the time. So there was a team of us who did a mapping of the culture. But we used a technique called appreciative inquiry to map the culture. So the way to get underneath the surface is to ask people, well, what are you good at? What are you proud at? What has worked? Where is the vitality? And so we were able to unearth the bits of the culture that were there that they wanted, and then of course then find ways to magnify it. And so there's talked about we want us to be much more collaborative. We want a culture that sparks off each other's ideas.
Right.
And I remember quite an amusing intervention we recommended, which was, well, if that's the case, how come you're all sitting at your desk emailing each other, asking questions, even though it could be even person next to you. So on Mondays, we banned emails for a short period, and said, therefore you're going to have to get up and walk and talk with someone, or possibly pick up the phone. And they hated it to begin with, but then they really liked it. So how do you change the culture in being this rubbing off each other, sparking ideas off each other? Of course, that happens much better when you're in the same room and debating.
Yes, I mean, in a more perhaps traditional hierarchical organisation, where those who are not at the very least middle management are not usually included in these conversations, do you actually meet resistance there? And if you do, how do you overcome it?
Yeah, and Neil, you've hit the nail on the head, because that's often where the greatest resistance to culture change is the middle management. And so you will get resistance. I've been in middle management. I've resisted, against change.
I'm sure we all have.
And it's trying to understand what is it that people have to lose, and sometimes you have to honour the loss before you can start to input the gain.
How does that translate into practical terms then, to honour the loss?
If there's going to be a shift in the normal way of working in a business, in an institution, in an organisation, the losses, I'm just trying to think of some examples that might... I mentioned earlier, as we were talking about the British Museum,
yes,
that was also a culture change programme.
Yeah.
And the losses there, and the culture that they wanted to change was that we want to be more able to work with diverse colleagues and diverse audiences. And so they had to, the middle management had to lose, and the middle management were called keepers. The department heads are called keepers. Yeah. And so the keepers had to lose some of the power. But what did they get back in return is what we have to focus on. What they had back in return was greater, more engaged audiences. It was much better profile within the museum as well as externally, much better recognition of what their department, what they were heading up, had to offer the rest of the world. And interestingly, there's only 4% in museums that we ever see. 96% of the stuff is...
Oh, yes.
Yes, exactly. And so they'd realised that actually there could be ways and diversity in thinking, diversity in working, yes, could help them. So they had a gain, but of course they had to lose old ways of working, old powers that they had.
Yes, yeah. I mean, you've obviously worked for a number of organisations and done consultancy work. Would you say you had a kind of restlessness about...
My wife has said to me, Raj, why don't you get a proper job? Then I'll know what to tell people what you do. Yes, I think restlessness, that's a good word. Yeah, I mean, life's too short for me anyway to be doing the same thing for too long. And that's why being part of an educator, being an educator is great. You meet and do lots of different things.
Yes.
Luckily, there are enough settled people around me to allow the restlessness.
Yes. One key area of interest for you is diversity, looking at your
Yes.
profile. Would your definition of diversity be mainly the six protected characteristics you referred to earlier, or do you have a broader or completely different definition?
Yes, I mean, those characteristics are really for legal purposes. And there's one main characteristic that just isn't included because when the Equality Act was established, the last Equality Act 2010 established, they couldn't work out a way to include class. or social inclusion. And so my definition of diversity is broader than the legal one. And of course, class is a major one. We have a caste system in Britain, whether we like it or not. The north-south divide, and how different communities within Oxford live.
Did you say class with a northern
I
accent?
said caste.
Did you say caste?
I said caste, and I meant to say caste.
Well, okay, that begs the question then.
Yes.
For those watching who are not familiar, perhaps, with the caste system, is it broadly comparable to the class system in the UK, or are we talking about many other dimensions?
I think we're talking about other dimensions too, because there are certain... the caste system in South Asia is often related to a religion. The caste system, or the class system in Britain, is related to economy, it's related to status, in different ways. So the two, however, does allow division and privilege. Yeah. And so it means that there are quite a number of people that we would say have an equal status in society, but there is an underlying system, call it a class system or a caste system, that doesn't allow for it in reality.
Yes. Well, it's. I'm sure you saw the preview of the report from the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. It was widely reported this morning, in which they suggest family structure and social class, and I'm quoting, more reliable indicators than race of where people end up in life. I'm broadly quoting. Would you share that conclusion, or would you have a different take?
Yeah, I think the conclusion that they came up with before the commission was set up.
Okay.
And so it's more of a political conclusion. Mm-hmm. It doesn't bear any reality to what's happening on the ground, and they base a lot of their findings on figures to do with education, and they're trying to argue that it doesn't matter what ethnicity you are in schools, everyone has an equal chance and everyone achieves, whereas actually the reality isn't the case. If you're black, you're 6 times more likely to be suspended from school. Your educational achievement is doesn't have that same... Why are so few teachers from non-white backgrounds, from black, Asian, and so the reality doesn't bear it up. Now, you and I know, probably you and I have also done it, you can take statistics and figures and manipulate them to get them to say what you want them to say. There was quite a... So the findings of this commission, I fear, may actually provoke disharmony rather than encourage another step forward, because we need another step forward, not just in this country, but in many countries in terms of ethnicity.
So as you were talking about class before, being one of the characteristics, if you were to perhaps draw up a legal definition, you might try to find a way to include. What do you feel could be done to address diversity in terms of helping those from lower social classes who
Yes.
don't have the access to opportunity, perhaps have family structures which are less supportive than those
Yes.
from wealthier backgrounds?
Yes, yes. I've been on 2 boards of governors of 2 schools in Oxford. One of them is in Summertown. Now Summertown is part of Oxford that's very rich, and all the, the school always got the highest score in an Ofsted reporting. The other school that I'm governor of at the moment is an area of Oxford which is the other end, and the last Ofsted report was it got a failed status. It was put under measures, and then they said, would you be willing to go on the board? One of the things that in working with schools and where there are class differences within the school itself or within the school system, the focus I believe has to be there is if you can reach the most marginalised, if you can make the education relevant for those that are least able to learn, the whole school benefits. Because if you can reach that person, you've reached everyone in between. And so that philosophy, that not just philosophy, used it in different schools. At a school in Birmingham, again, it was at the most working class end, or the non-working class. In fact, most parents never had a job. And using that philosophy, saw how the school's attainment increased. So let's make sure that if we can reach those that are the most marginalised, then actually is a measure of how the whole school is. And so that is, so we need to know who are the least marginalised. It's never one thing. It's not just class, it's not just ethnicity, it's not just gender, it's not just height or disability or whatever.
Yes.
You've got to look at, they call it intersectionality, or there are basically 3 or 4 factors that are at play. It's never as simple as one factor. And to be able to say, well, who is the most marginalised? Let's look at all those things that they have to cope with. And if we know that they can cope with them, then everyone else should also be able to cope.
Would you say that your concept of marginalisation or marginalised groups is quite situational? Because you said there are different factors that need to be considered when we're looking at who needs most targeted help in a particular situation. So is it situational, or are there some things which are inherent in all disadvantaged, marginalised groups?
It is, of course, situational. It's also historical, and if political is within the situational, it's definitely political as well. And it's both practical and psychological. A lot of the work on diversity that I've done, whether it's with women, whether it's with ethnic groups, whether it's with disabled groups, often is to help them to feel more empowered. And sometimes it's meant sort of challenging them on their lack of self-belief. And it's trying to bring to the fore that they are as much valued, as much valuable as anyone else. And for the marginalised groups, there's that psychological and historical trait that is often the first step.
Yes, I would agree. How do you feel about some of the terminology connected with what some might term identity politics? You might term diversity, such as BAME. Is it helpful or not as a term?
Yes, that terminology, what I love about that terminology is that we will never get it right. And I don't know why we beat ourselves up about it. And it's great that it keeps changing, and as we change as people. So I can remember in the 70s and 80s in Britain, the term coloured was there as the acceptable term. And then in the 80s and 90s, everyone who wasn't white was black because it was used more as a political term. So, and then we moved to BME, Black and Minority Ethnic, and then more recently to BAME. And of course, that commission that you're mentioning today has decided now BAME is not a good term. Of course, none of these terms can capture the richness that there is in each community. And so what I love is the fact that we continue to probe the terms that we have and decide that they're not good enough, because in deciding that we're having to delve into why they're not good enough and what will make them better, more contemporary. And so the terminology doesn't worry me as much as let's use it, because we don't go around saying, well, we don't know what to say. There are white people and non-white people. We don't go around saying there are men and non-men. It's also using terminology for me that is positive. Give a positive identity to everyone. If they are happy to have it, I don't know whether Neil, if I said to you, Neil, you're white, are you happy with it? If you're not, then let's try something else. But it should be positive. It shouldn't be a non-something.
Who do you feel makes the decisions about such terminology? If we're talking about inclusive conversations, which has been a theme of the discussion.
Probably the likes of you and I. We sort of sat in institutions, educational institutions. We might do some writing, we might quote this, quote that, and we might propose something. Then the politicians pick it up, or pick up what they think they want to use, and then it gets wrapped up into policy. And so there's a journey, isn't there?
Yes.
So I think we have quite a responsibility as researchers, as writers, to think about terms, keep thinking about the terms, because a name does have quite a lot of meaning. But of course, life isn't just all about terms, it's the impact of how that term is used that really matters.
Yes. Well, I would agree with you. I think that academic institutions their terminology tends to be picked up on, as you say, by governments and by the media, certainly. Is that a problem in terms of an inclusive conversation? If we're looking, for example, to compare that with organisational change that you might wish to occur, and those, whether it's agencies away from the centre in different countries around the world are dealing with the frontline situations, and yet the decisions are being made for them by the centre. Can we draw a parallel between that and the terminology which is arrived at, published in academic papers, and then filters through to wider society?
Yes. I think, as you asked the question, the name Steve Biko comes into mind. Often we are caught up worrying about the terminology. And of course, as academics, we are caught up with words and trying to really drill down into meaning. And the problem would be that if we allow terminology to take over the middle ground of whatever the subject is. And the reason I mentioned Steve Biko, because I remember reading some of his words before he was killed in South Africa. His words were the paralysis of analysis. And it's almost as if we can be paralyzed into a subject by just doing too much analysis and never getting on with the practical outworking of the change that's needed. So in organizations, I often give them a license to say, let's just find what terminology you're using. Who cares what the rest of the world is using? We'll just use that terminology. And then in the recommendation stage, I might write the recommendation as to what you're going to use after this piece of work, this intervention. But let's just use what terminology there is. Let's not try and let that steal the show, because it's the organisational change that we're looking for. And we can come back to that at a later time. But don't stop speaking. Use whatever words. We'll give you the license, and each other the license to use whatever is available. Yeah,
absolutely. So we're probably coming towards the end of our discussion. Was there anything in particular that you feel that you'd like to bring to the viewer's attention?
Yes, I suppose, just coming back to the coaching and mentoring, with all the work that I've done, one of the things that I think is incredibly helpful, especially for those people that want to move forwards in life, want to make a contribution, is to do what the privileged groups have been able to do easily, is to find a coach, is to find a mentor, and to help them with their own personal development. And so they can be both supported and challenged by their coach or their mentor. So I would say that I would encourage any students, anyone, any teachers, to find whether it's a coach or mentor that they need, and get on with the work, and have an objective for it, and use that, because the number of people that I've been involved in and programs of coaching, mentoring programs, the change has been dramatic. There's been a paradigm shift in the confidence in the place that they were to the place that they are going into. That it is just such a vital tool that it would be a shame. And as I say, it's often the marginalised, the non-privileged, that don't get to use the coaching and mentoring. And I would love to encourage them to go and do some of the find a coach and mentor, and maybe colleges, and many colleges have a program, can do more to engage those that might be less able or less knowledgeable about how to access that particular facility. So and there will be lots of what I call aha moments, or in the papers about coaching mentoring they call them critical moments, where there'll be light bulb moments where in your coaching and mentoring meeting there'll be things that spark off, but they will be things that spark off only for you. Different things will spark off for different people, and that's the opportunity when we as individual students, teachers, anyone else have to have the sparking going off, so that we can do more with our own lives, with our own contributions.
So following up from that, how do you feel about reverse mentoring?
Yes, I love reverse mentoring. Yes.
Talk
so reverse mentoring, what it is a traditional form of mentoring is you have a mentor who is experienced, who is older, who is wiser, and mentoring a younger person, maybe an apprentice or a new employee or whatever, and which is great. That works. It really is useful. Reverse mentoring is, but the concept is about trying to help the personal and professional development of someone. Now, if there is a developmental need that I have that someone else has who might be a bit older, then reverse mentoring comes into place. And a lot of reverse mentoring is done around IT. So there are senior management people, chief execs, keepers, who say, I want a reverse mentor who can help me be more confident about IT, about using digital devices. And so you'll get, a 20-year-old mentoring a 50-year-old. And it works with IT, it works with, I've seen it work with diversity. So you have someone who has lived experience of one or a number of forms of diversity, ends up mentoring someone who doesn't. And the aha moments are many. Oh, is that how I do it? I never knew, Yes. And so reverse mentoring is very powerful.
Yes.
But one has to be humble.
Well, often across the generations, certainly in terms of IT. One other thing, sorry, just before we wrap things up, that I mentioned to you in passing the other day was that I'd heard a recording you'd made some years ago at a festival where you were talking about, and I'll give you, I promise, full opportunity to expand upon this, about the importance of learning to confront when necessary and also to walk away when necessary. But the confrontation, remaining gracious in the confrontation. I think for me personally, that would be an interest if you could illustrate an example of that in a situation perhaps you found yourself in through your work, for example.
Yeah. First, I think I would say the word confrontation is important. It's not conflict. Okay, so confrontation isn't about trying to harm or win over someone else. That would be conflict. So confrontation is about, it's more about not being complicit. So not letting something go that really needs to be addressed. So you're confronting, facing. And so that's the first thing I would say. An example, there are many examples, and the one I'm thinking of, I'm almost reluctant to share, but let me share it. And the example is I've been brought up in an Indian Hindu background. I'm from a village in India. We still have a sugarcane and mango farm, and very traditional and conservative in our views. And so over the years, I've had to confront many of these conservative and traditional views. One of them has been about, what do I think of gay relationships? My conservative traditional view is they're wrong, and there are lots of arguments I would give that they're wrong. So I've had to confront my own value base, my own set of beliefs, in what do I really think? And the core of my belief is that everyone is created in the image of God, and so together there is no one created unequal. And so how can one person be less equal than someone else? How can therefore those that might be in a gay relationship be treated subserviently, treated negatively? And so that's been a confrontation that I've had to have with myself. Yeah. So that's one. But of course, organisations and businesses often need to confront. We know, as we are in the transition period of the digital age, or we are already in the digital age, we cannot be agile as businesses. We cannot be flexible, adaptive, learning enough as businesses, as leaders in businesses, unless we learn to confront, unless we learn, because we're in an ever-changing system now. There is always something new that we have to come up with. Therefore, we have to confront again and again and again accepted ways of doing things, accepted ways of knowing, accepted products, accepted marketing, accepted leadership, governance, etc., etc. And so confronting has to become a way of life, coping with uncertainty, ambiguity, paradoxes, polarities. We've got to be able to, because if we are complicit with them, all those that do confront, they will be the competitive businesses that will have the edge over us. And we know that those businesses that have failed to change, that fail to confront their own ways of doing things, have fallen by the wayside, and we teach this in class over and over again. But are there times to walk away? Because you've got this paradox. Sometimes you have to say, actually, in order not to be complicit, you've got to step off that treadmill, and so a friend of mine, I almost mentioned his name. PS are his initials. Police officer in the West Midlands Police Force, and looking at what was happening at the time that we were discussing the organisation, he said, and a family man, young children, doing really well in the police force, had got promotions already and was getting more promotions. He decided it was time to walk away. And I asked him, what happened? And he said, the way in which the police force is acting, he's tried to confront the things that he believes are wrong. Sometimes, in order not to become like the unjust system, one has to walk away. And in walking away, actually, you're still sending a signal. So it's not a defeat, but it's saying, actually, this is how much it's costing me to walk away, and this is how much I believe in the system for it to be a good system, that I can't contribute to it continually to go down the wrong line.
Okay. Well, Raj, we've covered a fair amount of ground this evening. Thank you so much for being our guest. It was a pleasure talking to you and to meet you, of course. And we hope to see you on future occasions. Don't be a stranger.
Thank you very much, Neil. And I look forward to interviewing you sometime.
Well, we'll have to see about that.
Cheers.
Thank you.